The Civil War was over. The Union had triumphed. Slavery, the institution that had defined and scarred America since its beginning, was legally abolished. But the end of the war did not bring peace. For millions of newly freed black men, women, and children, freedom was fragile, uncertain, and dangerous. Their first steps into liberty were stalked by shadows. And from those shadows rose a movement cloaked in hoods and robes, mounted on horseback, moving by night. A movement determined to strangle freedom in its cradle. The Ku Klux Klan. This is the story of their terror campaigns in the 1860s and 1870s. A campaign of fear and violence that sought to undo emancipation and destroy Reconstruction. It is a story of night riders and burning crosses, of families terrorized in their homes, of ballots stolen by blood, of teachers and ministers beaten for daring to educate and uplift. It is also a story of resistance, of free men who stood tall, of women who testified, of a federal government that, for a brief moment, confronted the hooded empire with law and force. This is not a story of costumes and secret societies. It is a story of terror, and it begins in the ashes of the Civil War. The year is 1865. The Confederacy is dead, its armies defeated, its leaders captured or scattered. The cities of the South bear the scars of fire and cannon. Fields, once worked by enslaved hands, lie empty, overgrown, silent. 4 million people, once considered property, are now legally freed. Freedom, however, is a complicated word. It promises dignity and rights. It promises the chance to work for oneself, to build a family without fear of separation, to worship without chains, to learn letters and numbers, to vote. But it also brought the questions. Where would free people live? How would they earn? Could they find safety in towns where they had once been enslaved? For white Southerners, the defeat of the Confederacy was not simply a military loss. It was an existential wound. A world they believed eternal had collapsed. Their wealth, once tied to enslaved labor, had shattered. Their political power, built on bondage, was stripped away. The presence of Union troops across the South made the humiliation visible, day after day. And in Washington, new amendments to the Constitution transformed the nation itself. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. The 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment, granting black men the right to vote. On paper, freedom was secure. On the ground, it would be fought for, violently. One freeman recalled the atmosphere. It seems as if the war was not truly over. The white man would not give up. They said, "You may be free by law, but you will never be free among us." From that bitterness, from that refusal to accept defeat, the seeds of a new movement began to grow. A movement that cloaked itself in secrecy, in mysticism, and in violence. Pulaski, Tennessee, Christmas Eve, 1865. 6 former Confederate officers, restless and delusioned, gather in a lawyer's office. They are young, they are defeated, and they are bored. They decide to form a club, a fraternity, something secret, something playful. They choose a name that sounds mysterious. Borrowed from the Greek word kykelos, meaning circle, they call it the Ku Klux, and add clan for rhythm. The Ku Klux Klan. At first, it is a little more than a prank. They dress in sheets, they ride along through the night, they pretend to be ghosts of Confederate soldiers wandering the earth. They frighten superstitious. They amuse themselves with tricks. But soon, the masks take a darker purpose. The war has freed the enslaved, but now, those free people sought to claim their rights. They went to school, They built churches. They registered to vote. They ran for office. And former Confederates watched in horror. The Klan became something more than a club. It became a weapon. Night rides turned into raids. Pranks turned into beatings. Costumes became uniforms of terror. The Klan spread quickly from Tennessee to Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, and beyond. Its organization adopted a language of empire. The leaders were called the Grand Wizard. State leaders were Grand Dragons. Local officers were exalted Cyclops. The name sounded fanfictual, even ridiculous, but behind them lay deadly intent. A congressional report years later described the change. What began as a fratonic, in a short time, amused the character of a great conspiracy. Political and military, in its organization and its purpose of violence and crime. The Invisible Empire, as it called itself, had been born. Imagine a quiet cabin in rural Georgia, 1868. Inside, a black family huddles together. A mother rocks her baby. A father sharpens a hoe. Nervous. The children whisper, "Mama, will they come tonight?" Then, in the distance, hooves. The sound of many horses, slow and deliberate. Dogs begin to bark. Through the trees, torches flicker. Then come riders, dozens of them. Faces covered in white hoods, robes flowing. Some carrying whips, others, guns. They circle the cabin, shouting threats. They demand the man inside come out. They accuse him of voting liberal. They accuse him of speaking proudly to a white man. They accuse him of forgetting his place. Sometimes the family is dragged into the yard. The father is beaten, pistol whipped, tied to a tree. The mother is threatened. The children cry. Sometimes the family survives. Sometimes they do not. This was the language of the Klan. Fear. Fear carried on horseback. The mask was not just disguises. They were symbols. They played upon superstition, convincing freemen that ghosts of dead Confederates would return to punish them. One writer testified proudly, "We made them believe we were supernatural," and many trembled in terror. But the violence was real. Whippings, lynchings, shootings, homes burned, churches desecrated, schools destroyed. The Klan targeted not just black families, but also white allies, teachers, ministers, and officials that stood with them. Anyone who supported Reconstruction, anyone who challenged white supremacy, was a target. One Union officer described the pattern. They come in the dead of night. They come in bodies of 50, 100, 200 men. They strike like lightning, and when they vanish, they leave no trace, but blood and ashes. By 1868, the Midnight Riders were no longer an isolated act of terror. It was a campaign, coordinated, ruthless, relentless. Freedom meant education. For centuries, enslaved people had been denied literacy by law. Now, in freedom, they built schools. They hired teachers. They filled churches, not just for worship, but for learning. To the Klan, this was intolerable. Teachers were beaten, whipped, threatened with death. Many white women from the North, volunteers who had come to teach free children, they faced the wrath of the Night Riders. One teacher in South Carolina remembered, "They came to my door, masked and armed. They told me if I did not leave by sunrise, I would leave in my coffin." And I left. Black ministers, too, were prime targets. Their sermons of freedom, their leadership in communities, made them dangerous in the eyes of the Klan. Churches were burned to the ground. Congregations were scattered. Education was not simply about letters. It was about power. Knowledge meant independence. Knowledge meant equality. And so, knowledge became a battlefield. Reconstruction promised not just freedom, but democracy. Black men registered to vote. They lined up at polling stations. They cast their ballot for liberal candidates, many of them black themselves. For the first time in American history, interracial democracy was real. But ballots became targets as deadly as bodies. The Klan waged war on elections. They stationed themselves outside polling places, armed and masked. They threatened, they beat, they killed. In one Georgia county, not a single liberal vote was cast after the Klan raids drove freemen into hiding. One freeman testified, "They told us if we voted the racial ticket, we would pay for it with our lives. I believed them, for I had seen men whipped. I had seen men killed." Assassination of political leaders became common. County commissioners, state legislators, even members of Congress faced threats. Some were murdered. The ballot box was supposed to be the foundation of democracy. In the hands of the Klan, it became a coffin. By 1870, the terror was undeniable. Reports flooded into Washington. Congress convened hearings. Freemen testified, trembling, before white politicians, recounting the horrors of the night raids. One said, "They told me if I voted again, they would kill me. They whipped me until blood ran. They told me, this is what you get for being free." The federal government acted. The Enforcement Acts, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts, was passed in 1870 and 1871. They made it a federal crime to interfere with voting rights. They authorized the president to use troops to suppress the Klan. President Ulysses S. Grant did not hesitate. He declared martial law in parts of South Carolina. Federal troops arrested hundreds of Klansmen. Trials were held, convictions won. For a brief moment, the hooded empire faltered. The terror seemed contained, but the resistance was temporary. Reconstruction was fragile from the beginning. It relied on the will of the North to enforce it, and that will was fading. By the mid-1870s, Northern voters grew weary. They wanted reconciliation, not endless conflict. They wanted economic growth, not costly military occupations of the South. The Klan, and the groups like it, the White League, the Red Shirts, adapted. They became less secretive, more open. They traded hoods for daylight parades. Violence continued, but so did political compromise. In 1877, the last federal troops withdrew from the South. Reconstruction was declared over. For Black Southerners, it was a betrayal. The Klan had not dispersed. It had simply succeeded. A freeman in Alabama summed up the feeling. We were free, but we were not safe. The law was written, but it was not kept. They had beaten us in the dark, and then they beat us in the daylight too. The Ku Klux Klan terror campaigns of the 1860s and 1870s was not a fringe phenomenon. They were not mere pranks. They were a counter-revolution. Their goal was clear: to destroy black freedom, to crush Reconstruction, to restore white supremacy. And in many ways, they succeeded. The legacy of those campaigns, the fear, the violence, the silencing of black voices, cast a shadow over the South to this day. But so too do the memories of resistance. For freemen who testified, of teachers who returned, of voters who, despite the threats, cast their ballot. History remembers the hoods and the torches, but it also must remember the courage of those who stood against them. Because the story of the Klan's terror is not just a story of violence, it is a story of survival. And it is a story America can't afford to forget. This episode is dedicated to Trey Reed. The Continuum is part of the Political Besties Network. Thank you for listening.